We are live.
All right, good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are picking up a proposal of amendment from Representative Logan on S 127 relating to emergency shelters. So we'll hear from Representative Logan first and then from our legislative council.
Computer's been a little bit slow. Apologies. I don't think anything's posted.
Oh, I sent it to Annika.
Oh, you did? Oh, is it?
You're up.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about this issue so far, the zoning for emergency shelters and municipalities. In the Home Act, we did begin requiring that municipalities with zoning provide a location within the municipality for emergency shelters. In current statute, there are limitations on how emergency shelters can be regulated in 24 VSA 4413. So and this is something we learned in the last committee conversation we had, whether even if the municipality is making emergency shelters a conditional use, the only conditions they could set would be in accordance with 4413, the limitations on municipal bylaws. So we've gone around a bit. I think there's still some questions that we have about what is allowed and isn't allowed, what those terms mean in that list, specifically location. And, you know, based on the sort of use cases that were presented to me by city council and our planning staff at the city of Burlington, I think we have some questions about whether or not current statute can accommodate what Burlington would like to be able to do. It sounds to me like it doesn't. And so the amendment here would attempt to address that issue. So
just articulate that issue because I know.
Yeah.
Remind folks.
Yeah. So the issue is that prior to the Home Act, the city of Burlington offered zoning for conditional use for emergency shelters throughout most of the city. This was in contrast to most municipalities throughout the state that did not offer any zoning for emergency shelter, which led to a situation that I think we might all be well aware of now, where shelters were becoming concentrated in places where they were allowed, and then we didn't have shelter anywhere else. And then we had issues with people experiencing homelessness being shipped all over the state to various motels. So we really wanted to see a broader distribution of shelters. And since the law passed, we have seen that. We've seen a few shelters open in areas where there currently were no emergency, or there were no emergency shelters prior to the passage of the Home Act. So accomplish that goal. However, in Burlington, we would like to do more than provide one shelter. We already have several shelters in Burlington. You know, we know that there are a large number of families experiencing homelessness, families with children. We would like to be able to put smaller shelters in low density residential neighborhoods and things like that. And so the effect of placing emergency shelters in this list of allowed uses in the limitations on municipal bylaws means that Burlington can no longer regulate, even through conditional use, an emergency shelter on anything except for the items in this first paragraph: location, size, height, building, bulk, yards, courts, setbacks, et cetera, et cetera. And so things like whether or not a low barrier shelter is being proposed to be built across the street from an an elementary school seem to be things that we would not be allowed to regulate the shelter on. And it all hinges on what the term location means. And the term only to the extent that regulations do not have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use of the emergency shelter. So how specific can Burlington be in its review, development review of permit applications for emergency shelters? And right now, what the city is contemplating is, because they don't believe that they would be able to exercise a high level of oversight on the operating conditions for that emergency shelter, they are thinking of, instead of having, conditional use permitting for emergency shelters throughout the city, contracting it down to just high density districts and a transit district, which would preclude the possibility of building small, family shelters or, residential shelters for people with disabilities exiting the hospital or coming out of treatment facilities or something like that. So that's the issue. We're basically trying to get questions answered about whether or not that interpretation is correct, that those limitations do in fact exist as a result of the statute. And if the answer is yes, those limitations do exist, then this amendment proposes to address that issue by striking out emergency shelters as one of the items in the list of allowed uses from 24 VSA 4413, and backing up a section in that chapter to 24 VSA 4412, required provisions and prohibited effects on municipal bylaws, stating that municipalities must include emergency shelters in their zoning, but as long as they have at least one district where emergency shelters are fully permitted, they may use conditional use review for emergency shelters in other districts. And because emergency shelters would no longer be in that list from the next section, that means conditional use can be defined by the community itself rather than in compliance with that list from 4413. And then there's this final sentence that I think is a question of whether or not we want this in there or how we want it in there. I have a proposal for how to slightly amend this if we want to, so that in those districts where emergency shelters are a permitted use, the municipality would not regulate hours of operation. So that would be up to the discretion of the permit or of the shelter provider. And then in every other part of town, in every other zoning district, the municipality would be able to use conditional use review. And that would include things like hours of operation. For example, there's mentioned that, they likely wouldn't, in a low density residential area, want an emergency shelter that closed for half of the day. They would, so that people had to travel to another part of the city to be during the day. We currently have a day station in Burlington, so we do have shelters that close for half of the day, that just several blocks away from the day station. But if you're up in the old New North End in a residential area, a few blocks away from an elementary school, you would have to walk, 3/4 of a mile, get on a bus, and then take a bus 20 minutes to get to the day station in order to be able to access daytime services. The other thing, right now in the definition of emergency shelter in section 4303 of Title 24, we don't include requirements like whether or not there are services on site for the emergency shelter. So that's another element that the city would like to be able to include in its conditional use review for shelters that are in, further out of downtown or off a transit line. They would, for example, want to require that emergency shelters provide supportive services on site, like case management and connections to other service providers. So,
Members have questions for Representative Logan. Representative Norm. I can see a question building.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it because it's likely just lack of understanding on my part. So maybe I'm just needing some education either from Representative or from council. So this section 4413, limitations on municipal bylaws. The very first thing there says the following uses may be regulated only with respect to. Does that mean if uses do not appear in this list, they can be regulated however the city wants to?
Yeah, that's a great segue to hearing from Ellen.
Okay.
What are the things, do we put boundaries on conditional use review in statute? I think,
Aside from what's shown here.
yes. Can towns
Mm-hmm.
regulate anything they want in conditional use or is there a definition of that?
Ellen Jakowski, Office of Legislative Counsel. So the only other section where municipalities have the authority to regulate land uses within the municipality if they adopt zoning. They have broad authority to do that, but they are bound by the handful of statutes in Chapter 117. And there are only a couple of statutes that dictate it. So including 4411, 4412, 4413, and 4414. And so unless something is addressed there specifically about how the town can regulate it, they have the authority to use their zoning authority as they see fit. And there are quite a few different distinctions. And so a different example is in 4414. In 4412, it does have this list of prohibitions on what towns can't regulate through their zoning.
Number one is housing.
yeah,
This is very interesting.
it is very
And how it
interesting.
relates to
isn't it?
this.
Mhm.
Right.
Housing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it emergency housing? I think it's emergency housing.
It's shelter. Yeah.
I was going to use energy as an example of something less controversial. So towns are not allowed to use their zoning to regulate where renewable energy generation is located because we have a statewide system for how that works. But otherwise, the things that are listed, like in 4412, prior to 3 or 4 years ago, were pretty high level and a little bit vague because you did give towns the authority on how to regulate these things. And then in the last few years, you've added more specific provisions, like with density for housing and requiring certain zoning districts to be more dense than others. 4413 is, so 4412, so there's the broad layout of towns can regulate land use. But then in 4412, there's a list of things they can't regulate through their land use. And then 4413A has this list of things that in some places have been referred to as community uses. And so the rest of the list is a list of regulate, only a defined list of ways that they can regulate. Because the rest of the list generally are things that are either state-owned or community used properties. And so it's state or community-owned institutions and facilities, private or public schools, churches and places of worship, public and private hospitals, solid waste management facilities, hazardous waste management facilities. And so that was the list for a long time. And then 2 years ago, you added emergency shelters and hotels and motels converted to permanently affordable housing developments. And so prior to that, there was this list of things that were community uses that the town could not fully regulate. They had some zoning, physical regulation of, but not necessarily the other aspects, like the regulation of how the business operated. And so it is a more limited list than the way other things are regulated under this chapter. There are other things listed, for example, further in 4433, like energy and farming, that the towns don't have any say on.
You're in 4433 right now.
4413. Yeah. So this is sort of one of the medium, I think of it sort of as the medium sort of list. It seems like the town only has limited say on what they can regulate on these types of land uses.
So did you say they can do then whatever, they can regulate other things then that are not on this list?
Yes, or listed in 44, 12, 13, and 14 are sort of the three statutes where there are limitations put on zoning and how towns regulate.
13 and 14. I'm looking.
12 is that long list that includes like the density. It also has the stuff about accessory on farm businesses. Yeah, communications towers. So it's not a huge list of things that towns have limited regulation over.
So if I can continue my question, so that if we perform this removal of item G, emergency shelters, does that, if we remove that from this list, does that give towns more authority or more flexibility or less flexibility in how they deal with emergency shelters? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I think the intent is to give them more flexibility.
More flexible. Okay, so if we move from this list, then they have flexibility to do essentially what they want, because it doesn't appear anywhere else in the regulations to limit it.
Right. And so,
What you're trying to achieve, to give the towns more flexibility?
So what
So
I think
long
what
as-
I'm gonna, if I try to articulate what I think we're trying to achieve, which is your towns are required to accommodate an emergency shelter with the limitations of those conditions, the way it is today.
Yeah.
And if a town wants to provide emergency shelters in more districts, they reserve the right to have full conditional use review.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to accomplish with this amendment.
So do
The
you want me to?
second half of the amendment.
And I want to just make sure that's what we're getting to with this amendment, but it's first,
what-
we got to understand what we're trying to do.
What we're trying, so is what you just phrased succinctly, thank you, is what we're trying to accomplish with this amendment or what's already in statute?
So I have a question about I think that the statute may be silent on this. If a town currently is accommodating the minimum of an emergency shelter with these requirements, what is keeping them from having an emergency shelter elsewhere with full conditional use review?
that entry language, that intro language,
Okay.
they can only regulate to the extent of this list.
Yeah, okay, good. That's clear. So they cannot do what Representative Logan's community wants to do today. So I think we're getting close here.
So what is it about what's going on in Burlington that they are prevented from doing because of this list of
Yeah, like
You keep giving it, it's okay, don't give a location example. We need
Yeah,
other.
I'll
Okay.
give you an example. For example, in a low density residential area, I don't know how familiar you are with Burlington, but we have this large residential area up in the New North End. That's more suburban feeling. If the city council wanted to deny a permit application for a low barrier shelter, meaning anybody can stay there. And wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be able to deny that permit application on the basis of the fact that it's a low barrier shelter, because that's
Yes, they would, because.
regulating its operations.
Oh, because today they allow an emergency shelter. Yeah, I got it.
elsewhere,
In that zone. No, in that.
in
zone.
that same zone.
They allow it now and they would like to keep allowing it, but have regulation.
Well,
Limit.
right now, they have conditional use,
Mhm.
right? And so they,
Yep.
any permit application for a low barrier shelter that is, say a block away from an elementary school up in the New North End, it's all, very low barrier residential. That under this current law, if there was zoning allowed for that for emergency shelters in that zone, like there currently is for conditional use. The only conditions they'd be able to regulate that shelter on would be that list.
Yeah, but you keep saying that. They could say, we don't want a shelter within a quarter mile of a school.
Is that true? But they do want emergency shelter within a quarter mile of a school, but they don't want low barrier shelters.
I
Okay.
think that's the stronger argument to focus on, because one of the other things that's included, and it's included in the amendment you have, is you did include specifically 2 years ago about daily and seasonal hours of operation.
Yeah.
And so that was added specifically for emergency shelters, saying that towns cannot specifically regulate their hours of operation, because there were a few towns where that was becoming a real issue.
No.
And so I'm thinking of it more of like under this list in 4413, a town cannot regulate the operational aspects of an emergency shelter. It's just the zoning aspects. And it seems like
Who it serves or when it
Right.
serves, or essentially where they.
Right.
So we also have Representative McGill with us. And I just want to give you a chance to weigh in on this as you're following the conversation. Feel free.
Yeah, I am here on behalf of our chair, Teresa, Representative Wood, who had to be at an appointment. Our concerns and what we want to make sure there aren't any consequences is our hope is to continue to have shelters being built in areas where we kind of have a desert and there's a need. The legislation we did put in was really successful at that, and we're hoping to see more of that. So that is our biggest concern, is that this won't in some way inhibit the development of new shelter around the state. That's our biggest, kind of the biggest concern, and just making sure that any legislation around the actual operation rules things within the shelter. We would, I know Representative Logan, there had been some suggestions from the city of Burlington, and some of those things we just felt we would need to hear testimony because they would affect budgets and ultimately like our state HOP funding and how that was allocated. So some of those things we were just a little concerned about throwing into an amendment.
And Representative McGill is, there was some discussion about redefining emergency shelter in section 4303, which we're not talking about at all today right now.
So talk about it. It's too
Yeah,
confusing.
it's too confusing.
And it's not ready.
And we're not ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's agreement that
Yeah,
we're in a process with that, so we're
yeah.
not talking about that today.
But yeah, so essentially what we want to do is we want to retain that requirement for municipalities across the state to provide a location for emergency shelters in their community, but we don't want to prevent cities like Burlington that want to have shelter throughout the city from having a little bit more oversight of the operations of the shelter that they're allowing in that area. So yeah. So like,
I'd like to open it up for questions. I think we get it. And I would like members, Representative Austin, did you have a question?
I'm just wondering if there's any funding attached to this, because in Colchester,
This is just a zoning change.
yeah.
what?
This is
This is
nothing.
zoning
with-
change.
Okay,
Yeah, it doesn't mandate that a municipality have a shelter. It
we have to
man,
have a shelter, which is fine. I mean,
well,
that's,
you only have to have it you have
In your
to allow
zoning.
it in zoning. But
Right.
you'd have to have somebody actually apply for a zoning permit
Want to do it.
who wants to do it, and
Right.
they would bring the money
okay,
with them
Yeah.
to do the project.
So
for operations and resources.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
one thing I'm thinking of, it's in the negative right now. And I'm wondering about is there a way for us to clarify that underlying requirement with the limitations, I think, that are maybe still valid for that one zone? We need to be clear that that is what we are still requiring.
Yeah,
You are requiring a town to accommodate or allow for an emergency shelter somewhere with limited conditions.
Yeah.
So that's And I think this may do it, but I'm not sure it's as clear as it could be.
Yeah, my original suggestion was that we leave the term emergency shelter in 4413, but then have something further down in that section that says, so long as a municipality does provide, like similar to this language,
And then what?
then else, essentially they'd be exempt
Mhm.
from that requirement in any other zone.
Yeah, and what happened to that idea?
I don't understand how that works.
Yeah, that's what happened to that idea. Ellen feels like that doesn't work.
Could you not withstand it? We do that all the time, or I don't know, like, or, but, okay, so anyway, do members have thoughts or questions about this from their, you know, Representative Morris?
Thank you. It's just when I heard, at least my interpretation, what I heard, and I apologize if my interpretation is incorrect. I heard, wraparound services, being part of the municipalities or cities, conditional use permits. And I'm wondering what happens if we have multiple locations and the wraparound services aren't able to staff appropriately those services. Would that in effect deny the applicant from having an emergency shelter?
Well, right now, there are no requirements for
Understood.
wraparound services.
But I heard you mention services.
Right, so that is something that in a conditional use permit review, that the development review process, they would be discussing that with the proposed shelter operator. Yeah, I mean, that would be something that Burlington could say, oh, well, if you're not able to staff this with supportive services, then no, you can't have the permit.
That was the intent that
Yeah,
that's how I perceived the intent.
yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Like,
Representative Tagliavia.
I joined this a little bit late, so maybe I'm a little bit behind the eight ball here. Emergency shelters is struck from this, and I don't know. I was looking, I didn't see a definition, so how is this going to change? And how will this, I understand what you're looking to do in Burlington, how in rural towns is this going to affect their ability to, Representative Norris said, staff a facility? And will there be the need for permanent staffing? I hear emergency and I think temporary. And
Temporary,
having
that's worse.
someone constantly on staff, what kind of a burden is that going to be? And where will that burden fall? On the municipality or on a private entity providing service?
On the private entity providing the service. So it'd be up to the service provider. So essentially, the way that the language is written now, if you imagine, say, I don't know, pick a smaller town in your area that,
Well, let's say Orange.
okay, Orange. Let's say Orange decides that they want, that, a service provider decides that they would like to open a small emergency shelter in Orange to service Orange County. But they only have enough funding to operate in the winter. This would prevent the municipality from saying that you can only operate in the winter and that you have to operate 24 hours a day. Current law, that's what current law would say. So they would grant the permit to the operator, and then it would be up to the operator to decide, when they're open. If it's just for winter, if it's just at night. And Orange would not be able to say, you have to be open year round, you have to be open 24 hours a day, you have to have staff 24 hours a day. The municipality would not be able to make that requirement of the shelter operator under current law.
So, do you have more?
I'm probably gonna have a bunch more, but this makes me wonder, is this going to be considered a commercial use? Or is this gonna be some sort of a hybrid of a residential use? And there's a whole bunch of questions
It's a
floating
social
around.
service. So,
Let's
but
hear from Ellen.
For what purposes? Under Act 250, it would be a commercial use, but we're talking about zoning right now. So so we would be specific to this type of use, which is defined as an emergency shelter.
that brings up the next question. If we're looking at residential use housing and promoting that, I'm just trying to figure out how this fits into the CHIP program.
Oh, it's.
Doesn't.
So I reached out to our planning support teams at the regional planning commissions, and they were unable to join us on very short notice this morning. However, Charlie Baker responded. He says, although not available to testify, I did review this with a couple of other planners and think the new language is fine. The current language allows regulation as to location, etc., and the proposed language does much the same. Hope this helps. So, I shared Representative Logan's amendment and then the framing of it that we've just heard with him, and that was his response.
So in trying to figure out where to draft this, so going back to some of your earlier discussion, so I think the issue you're addressing is different than what you were addressing 2 years ago. And it strikes me more to how 4412 talks about mobile home communities. 4412 says that a town, the bylaws shall not exclude mobile home parks. They have to allow them in at least one district. And then otherwise they have ability to regulate them. And so it seems like it's sort of more akin to that than some of the other. And so that's why.
You'd point us to that section in 4412.
Sure, it's 4412. It's 4412C. 1C. And so
Let's see, wait, I'm at a
Right
C
at the
that,
top.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
A
1C.
lot of C's in there.
Yeah.
But adding, I was trying to address some of the other concerns and then, but other than that, I don't know if there's too many other examples in the statute about the type of boundaries you're trying to put on this. Because previously you weren't nearly as detailed and prescriptive in this statute for other land uses. So like 4412(1)(c) is pretty short, but it does give the indication that a town can't prohibit them entirely. They have to have at least one zone for them.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, drawing that similarity, because of course, manufactured housing communities are housing. So the use is people live there. So as a type of place where people can live within your municipality, the municipality can't exclude them. But we do still want to say that, bylaws shall have at least one district where emergency shelters are a permitted use and have to have that limited list around which they can be regulated. So that, I think, that's, I think, the difficulty and why we were trying to put it in 4413, because we do want to say, like, you can't nitpick this project to death and say like, oh, well, you need to have blue walls and, you have like, whatever. You can only serve children. You have to be like, we do want less input on operations in at least one district. Like we want, for example, the goal would be, if there was a shelter provider who was going to come along, have the funding, wanted to apply for a permit, start an emergency shelter, we would want there to be a place within the municipality where they could stand up a low barrier shelter. This means you could be, a substance, you could be suffering from substance use disorder and be accepted into that shelter. You could be coming out of the criminal justice system and be eligible for that shelter. So we want there to be places for people to go, besides the streets, who are difficult to house for that, and even difficult to shelter. So we want there to be a place like that, a zone for that, if a shelter operator can stand up a project to do that. So we don't want the municipality to be able to exclude through the conditional use development review process, a project like that from existing in their municipality, which is what was happening. That was the problem we were trying to solve 2 years ago, is that shelter provider in St. Johnsbury had tried for years to get a permit to open a low barrier shelter. It's now open. It's the only low barrier shelter in the entire NEK. There wasn't one before. People had to travel all the way to Barry to
Representative
shelter.
Sakowicz.
I want to go back to what Rep. Logan said a minute ago about not striking emergency shelters from 4413. Because it seems like we have current statute, which is doing a lot of what we want it to already do, but we want to make some additional, we want to just make a change to what is already happening. So you suggested this and then, but our lead counsel said that's not going to work. But I just want to say what I think you were trying to say and then find out in some more detail why it would or would not work. So it seems like we could simply add a line to that section that just says something along the lines of, for municipalities that are following the, that part of the law where they do allow shelters in at least one zone, that shelters in additional zones don't have to follow the same conditional use requirements, that they're able to attach more conditional use requirements to those additional shelters. And that just seems like that would be the straightforward way to change the law and not undo what we already have in place, avoiding some potential confusion in terms of what the minimum is.
Why can't we make that clarification in 4413?
Because I don't know how you would draft it. So I mean, if you have language, I don't think that legally works, but if you think, I don't think so. But because I don't know how to draft that. So
It seems like the same language that you put in 4412 in the amendment, but just as a subsection of 4413. Like the bylaws.
Shall have at least one district where emergency shelters are.
Or
So I think it's a drafting question that perhaps needs to go to maybe like just a larger think tank of drafters, and we just make sure. And I just also about to ask the planners who use this section of statute regularly, if they had thoughts on that too. Representative Tag, yeah, then
Just so I understand what Representative Sakowicz was talking about, if there's one already existing in a district, the second one would have different criteria to actually exist. Is that
second one in a
correct?
different district.
would have different, the town could limit it more.
So as long as they have one district that complies with section 4413, then in any other zoning district, they would not have to
Zoning
meet
district.
4413.
Representative Austin.
Yeah. Just want to talk about just something that I think is happening. I know in Colchester, and I just don't know if this is a place to have it or if this is a bill to have it, but what we found, and we have no opposition to having a homeless shelter, a low barrier. What we have found is the impact it has on our emergency services and the cost it is to Colchester taxpayers. Because in terms of the data from our town manager, calls for emergency services, just even just illness, if there's not a wraparound service there, if someone's sick, if someone's injured, it's our emergency services that have to go there, and we don't mind going there. But I feel like the homeless situation is all of Vermont. It shouldn't be just Burlington or Colchester. And I'm just concerned about municipalities, those taxpayers having to pay for this concern that we all have for municipal services.
Well, first, I do think that the hotel motel program is being confused with emergency shelters.
It is. So I'm trying to.
Colchester doesn't have a shelter.
Right. But we have a location for one.
Right.
And my sense is that if and when, and hopefully soon, that shelter is stood up.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about the impact on our municipal fire rescue EMT services that are called there. You know, just in terms of not having a doctor there or not having, to transport people to the hospital or to deal with.
Yeah, we have a lot of shelters in Burlington that don't have services like that included in it.
Right.
It's
So I don't know if
eight
this
to
is.
10 bill,
if
$8
this
to
is-
$10 million price tag for
Yeah.
our municipality
Yeah,
every.
I don't know if this is a place, but it is a concern because when you say that, it puts. I just wish the state had some funding available for municipalities to offset some of those costs for emergency services. And I don't think this is the bill to include that in, but that is a concern.
Yeah, no, that's a great human services.
And I just
Yeah.
recommend for
Representative
HUB
McGill.
funding, which is the largest funder of, they do have to have services. HUB, the policies and guidelines, so anything funded through our state, any shelter does have that requirement. And that's part of the review process. And if you're interested, I can send you along what those policies and guidelines are and how they, when they're doling, like figuring out what they're going to fund and not, how they review. And that is a big component
And
of it.
in our.
There are other sources,
Yeah.
there's COC, there's other sources of funding, which we can't control as a state, but the HOP funding, which is our state funding, does require services.
So is that wraparound services and emergency services that would go to these locations?
Yeah, I
Can you
mean,
just say what HOP
Representative-
is for the environment?
Housing Opportunity Program.
that funds emergency shelter providers, but I will say it doesn't require that there be on-site medical services, which I think is what you're
Yeah.
talking about. And that's something that that is an issue in our shelters in Burlington, is that we're seeing people with pretty significant medical needs. And it would be extremely expensive to provide on-site medical services at a shelter.
But I'm sure your fire and rescue are also.
They're very busy.
Are very busy, right?
Yeah.
And I think it should be a shared cost across the state. That.
Each.
So that's
We
all
would
I'm,
love
that's
that.
all I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that was the intent of the zoning changes made earlier in the Home Act. Is anyway,
It's what?
is that it spreads out that communities take responsibility in their communities. Yeah.
So I no longer think I understand what you're asking for, because I think I thought what I heard Representative Sackowitz suggest is actually different than what Representative Logan's language was.
Well,
But
one-
can I just,
Yes.
okay, so permitted as used in this amendment, as in used in the statute, means the town is not doing any review. They just submit their notification to the zoning administrator. So you would not be using the list in 44A at all.
this goes further.
Yeah, which I don't think we want to do. That's part of thank you for noticing. That's one of my concerns. I think the situation we have right now is working for the problem we were solving before. The statute we have is working. And now all we want to do is find the right place in statute to say, and in other districts, a town may use full conditional use review or whatever the right word is to regulate emergency shelters. And I understand your challenge, and I just think we need to put it in the think tank of Ledge Council and see if there's a way around it or where we should put it.
So you're saying a district where there still is review of an emergency shelter, and in other districts, it's more review.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's limited to the list in 4413. I will say this is confusing because the way that this had been interpreted up until now by planners was that it would just be a permitted use. So like Burlington was planning to create 3 zones where emergency shelter is a permitted use. And then they wanted to be able to subject it to full development review in other districts, but right now feel like they can't. what I'm realizing is they could still make shelter a conditional use in those three districts, but it would be that limited list of
Yeah.
conditions, and then they want to not be held to that list in low and medium density residential.
Yeah, like, what is their list that they also want to regulate? But maybe that's another
Yeah,
quest. I just think, because so far the examples haven't resonated fully with me, but did you have something else?
Yeah, I just thought we could include language that would be in 4413, keeping, emergency shelters in that section, but then just sort of modifying the language below to say something like, however, municipalities may have additional districts where emergency shelters are permitted and may use conditional use review for emergency shelters in those districts.
Something like that.
Does that make sense?
I mean, I'm not gonna give a first impression on something you just read out loud.
I think that that's a great suggestion and a great segue to our wrapping this conversation up. Go ahead.
No, that's all just sentences that make sense and could work.
Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to back up to what is the goal? In this case, we're talking about Burlington. What is the goal of Burlington? To restrict emergency shelter in certain neighborhoods unless they have conditional approval and services? And wouldn't that have the same effect as we talked about not having it elsewhere? Would that have the same effect of pushing it elsewhere?
no.
No.
Where would they go
What do you mean? Well,
for emergency shelter?
well, right, they would have three districts in Burlington where those conditions, they could not be regulated on those conditions. That's all of downtown Burlington, another high density area, and the entire transit district. So, which is, along the bus lines in Burlington. So those are the places where shelter operators could apply for permit or could put in a permit notice. And anyway, the way that it's been discussed, there would be subject to far lower development review in those districts. And that's currently, that makes sense. Like our transit center is located in one of those districts. They are higher density. They have access to other services like healthcare and, so it's fine.
We're gonna put a wrap on this. Any other questions from members?
So I guess I was trying to say earlier that there's nothing in zoning akin to what you're trying to do. And so, I mean, I almost think you should just create a new statute if you're gonna be this prescriptive, and then you could control the list of things you're going to regulate. Because I don't see how you would say, you would add something to a list that already has like interpretation where you're saying for these uses, you use this, except only one time, any other time you don't. Like, that's not generally how we.
Well, it's just in that zoning district, it applies, and then in other zoning districts, it doesn't.
Right. We don't do anything like that though currently in the zoning. So that's why I'm just saying, like, I'm worried about the interpretation of that. And so I can try to come up with a new draft, but
Yeah, I
that's
think
why I
that's what
drafted.
we're gonna try to
it this
do.
way.
So this is great. We've made great progress. Thank you all. I think we're gonna take a break until the top of the hour and shift